Hi, my name is Marilyn Whitlock. I'm an English instructor for Excelsior classes. I'm preparing this video for both parents and students who want to know what plagiarism in their writing is and how to avoid it. In order to show you that, I'm going to share some screens with you, so just a moment. There you go. You should be able to see a presentation titled Purging Plagiarism. We definitely want to purge or get rid of all types of plagiarism in writing. I wanted to start my presentation on a light note with a cartoon up in the right-hand corner. This young student has two basic confusions. First of all, he says, "What do you mean all my facts are wrong? I copied everything straight off the internet." So first of all, he's confused about the fact that everything we find on the internet is not necessarily correct, is not necessarily a fact. And in the second bubble, he doesn't realize that he has committed the serious literary crime of plagiarism by just copying someone else's work off the internet. So no, plagiarism is not now legal. So let's talk for a minute about why it is so important to purge plagiarism from writing. First, probably most people are aware plagiarism is morally wrong. It's literary theft, stealing someone else's words or ideas, stealing their work. It also, though, signals that the researcher is not competent. This person doesn't handle facts carefully and doesn't know how to correctly cite the work that they've done. Because of both of these reasons, the moral reason and the incompetency reason, plagiarism discovered in someone's work will discredit that person. Unfortunately, in our United States society, we've had several instances of this in recent years. For example, Ben Carson, the political candidate, wrote this book, America the Beautiful, in 2012. It was discovered to have plagiarized passages. Most people believe these were accidental plagiarisms, but again, it does signal incompetent research and it does discredit the person somewhat. The next example we've got here is a young woman who certainly should have known better because she's a journalist. She's trained to handle words. But in 2014, Marie-Louise Gumachin from CNN was discovered to have plagiarized in multiple articles. So she did lose her position over that. It's considered very serious. Unfortunately, in the Christian community, we've also had recent instances of plagiarism. In 2013, Mark Driscoll, along with some research assistants, produced this book, Trial, and later it was discovered to have significant plagiarisms. Another book, but this one even more recent, published in 2015, called A Justice Primer by Douglas Wilson and Randy Booth, was discovered to have plagiarized passages. In all these cases, there were serious repercussions. So we want to avoid plagiarism as we learn how to write well. Well, what is the most frequent cause of plagiarism? The most frequent cause is really usually not intentional theft. It's usually just ignorance of how to document the research that we do. One prime example of that ignorance is illustrated in my conversation bubble here. A student who says, "That paragraph isn't plagiarized. I copied it from Wikipedia." Wikipedia is a common place that students will start in their research, and unfortunately, many of them don't realize that they can't just copy and paste from Wikipedia. Someone wrote those words. They belong to someone. So we can't merely copy and paste them without being guilty of plagiarism. So what exactly is plagiarism? Well, there are four major types of plagiarism, and the first one most people are familiar with. Copying someone else's exact words without using quotation marks. That's the kind of plagiarism most people are familiar with, word for word copying. But there are three other major types of plagiarism as well. And the second one is using someone else's unique idea without giving that person credit. Now you'll notice that I italicized the word unique because it's perfectly acceptable to use common knowledge, common background facts in writing. So for example, if a person were writing a research paper about George Washington, you could state that George Washington was President of the United States. That's common knowledge. So I'm going to show you in a bit an example of a unique idea that would have to be given credit for to avoid plagiarism. Another type of plagiarism is quoting someone and even using quotation marks, but not citing the source where the quotation was taken from. And that's also true of paraphrasing. If a writer paraphrases a source, you still must give credit to the source, even though you don't have to use quotation marks when you're paraphrasing. And the last one that I find is a very common source of misunderstanding is that when a student does paraphrase, the student cannot just pick a few words out of the source and replace just those words. The entire sentence structure has to be changed, and that's called syntax. So I'm going to demonstrate on my next several slides how to avoid each of these errors. So here I have an example of the most common and obvious type of plagiarism. Here is someone who's quoting from Tolkien's The Hobbit. And in the first box on the left, I have the exact source quotation in quotations. This is what Tolkien wrote, starting with he and ending with books. Now, a plagiarized version of this would be to just replace the word he with Gandalf, and then to include the exact same words without any quotation marks or any marking of the source. That is clear plagiarism. And to correct it, the student could leave Gandalf, because you really, as a writer, if that's all the reader has, you do need to replace the he, the pronoun, with the person that's being written about, Gandalf. But then we need quotation marks to show that this is an exact quotation. And we also need the source of the quotation. Now, there are several different styles for documenting sources. I'm going to illustrate to you Modern Language Association source, often abbreviated as MLA, because that's what's used most commonly in humanities courses like English, history, government. So in that style, right after the quoted material, you have the name of the author and the page number from which the quote was drawn. So all of those elements are necessary to avoid plagiarism. Now that, as I said again, is the most obvious kind of plagiarism. Let's look at copying an idea. This is when you use someone else's original idea but fail to give them credit. That's another type of plagiarism. So again, in the left-hand box, I have the exact source. This is about some research from an article posted on the internet about where Tolkien got his ideas for the hobbits and for the people of Rohan and Gondor. Here's a plagiarized version. Notice that the same idea is used, but it's paraphrased. However, there's no indication that this was taken from a source. And this is that writer's unique idea. So in order to correct it, we need to do two things. First, we need to state who the author is that authored these actual words. So I start my correction to the sentence, in her research, Gloria St. Clair. And then I include the paraphrased material. And notice I don't have to use any quotation marks here because this is a paraphrase. But I do have to have a reference to the author, and I have to have the source listed. And this is from the title of the source on the internet, an overview. Now, because this is a short presentation, I do not have for you the list of the works cited page, which is a page that a student would put at the very end of his or her writing that would list all the biographical details. This is just showing what a student would need to have in the research paper itself so that they would not be guilty of plagiarism from copying an idea. So that's the second type of plagiarism. A third type either quotes or does paraphrase the source correctly, but doesn't list the source at all. So I have the example here of a sentence from the source. This again is a sentence from The Hobbit. And it just has quotation marks. There's no introduction to the quotation. It's just dropped into the paper without introductory wording. And over here, the plagiarism, you'll see it's exactly the same. Just has quotation marks, no indication of what the source is. So in order to correct that, the writer would need two things. The writer would need an introduction, as Roach warns Thorin, and it needs to list the source at the end of the quotation. And here we have it, Tolkien on page 269. Now the example I gave you here is of a quotation that fails to have the citation at the bottom. You do also need to have a citation if the source is merely paraphrased. If that source, as we said on the last slide, is listing unique facts from in the paraphrase. Then there is a fourth type of plagiarism possible, and that's where the syntax or the structure of the sentence is not changed enough from the original. So if a person just writes and uses someone else's basic sentence structure, but only substitutes a few words, still is too close to the original and is a kind of plagiarism. So on this slide, I have an example from another article that was written analyzing the poetry of The Hobbit. Here is the exact quotation from the source in the left-hand box. And over here we have a plagiarism because the person did paraphrase, but didn't paraphrase completely enough. Notice the words that are the same. In The Hobbit, that phrase is right here. Poetry, poetry. And then right here, the author changed one word, a verb. Instead of highlights, the author put underscores, but then included these same words, the enormous differences, but instead of enormous, just switched the word to large, and then included the same words between the races of Middle-earth, between the races of Middle-earth. So you can see that the person just left out a few words and put in a few original words, but the sentence structure is still basically the same. So that is an incomplete paraphrase. To correct it, the writer would need to have not only words changed, but the entire sentence structure changed. And you can see in the bottom, I've given you an example of that. The great diversity among the characters of The Hobbit is well illustrated in its poetry. And then notice I also gave credit to the source. Quinn is the name of the author who wrote this article. And again, at the end of the research paper would be a page that would list all the biographical data. But in the sentence itself, you need to have just a citation to the source. So those are the four basic kinds of plagiarism that we all want to avoid in our writing. So to sum them up, anything that's quoted, whether it's from a print or electronic source like the internet, has to be introduced, can't just be dropped in with quotation marks, but then after it's introduced, it has to be placed in quotation marks and followed with a citation. The citation is the information in parentheses that lists either the author and the page number or the title of the work and a page number. Paraphrases have to be made of unique information, and those paraphrases also have to be followed by a citation crediting the source. And finally, a thorough paraphrase has to be done that alters both words and sentence structure. So these are the basic ways that research material can be handled to avoid plagiarism. So I want to end my presentation to you by saying if this presentation has raised any questions in your mind, I'm happy to answer those questions. So please feel free to contact me at my email address of marilynwhitlock@excelsior.com. If you're interested in information about any of the classes or clubs that Excelsior offers, I encourage you to join our newsletter at this address or to like us on Facebook. And if you're interested in my classes in particular, in the fall of 2017, I'm going to be teaching a number of different grammar and vocabulary courses, as well as a senior level class in British literature. I'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.